Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this week. My name is Lauren Arnold. I work as a project coordinator for the University of British Columbia and ACARN. This is the second of 3 webinars on agriculture water policy in a changing climate. These webinars are presented by the University of British Columbia Okanagan and the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network. This session, we have 2 excellent speakers with us. If you've missed the session last week or will miss the session next week, you can join us and watch those recordings. As we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. And we have people joining us from many places today, and so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands as well. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping items. We have 2 presenters today. We're going to have a question break after each presenter. We encourage you to make use of the chat box throughout the webinar. But to ask questions to the presenters, please use the Q&A box instead of the chat. You can see the Q&A box on your toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Using that allows us to keep track of the questions a little bit easier, and you can also upvote other people's questions by clicking the thumbs up symbol. And that allows us to see which questions are most important and which questions that a number of people have. So with that, I'm really pleased to begin the session with Dr. Famiglietti. Jay is the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, where he holds Canada Research Chair in Hydrology and Remote Sensing and a faculty appointment in the School of Environment and Sustainability. Jay is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and the Geological Society of America, and he is a regular advisor to state, provincial, and federal government officials on water security issues. So with that, I will hand it over to you.
So thanks everyone. And thanks for coming out this afternoon. And I want to give kind of a big picture satellite-based view of some of the work that I've been doing and some of the implications for Canadian and global food security, although it's really more about water security and implications for food security. So many of you have probably seen this. These are the warming stripes for British Columbia since 1901. So they really give sort of a graphic representation of how without much clutter, just showing the colors going from cooler to warmer. And, a lot of that warming's happened since 1990. And many of you have probably seen some of these figures as well. This is from the Canada Climate Change report from 2019, and showing the temperature changes in Canada. And you see a lot of stuff happening in the winter and the spring. And, a lot of that's happening in British Columbia in particular in the winter. So, it's pretty challenging times. We've heard, Canada's warming at twice the global rate. Northern Canada is warming at 4 times the global rate. Here, I'm in Saskatchewan, that's warming at 3 times the global rate. So, we know that stuff is happening. And one of the things that's happening is that the water supply is becoming more variable. And so we are expecting precipitation across Canada to increase, but summer rainfall may decrease. And so this is going to be a problem for growing food. Along with that, the seasonal availability of fresh water is changing because more of the precipitation is falling as liquid precipitation because it's warmer rather than snow in the mountains. So it's washing off the mountains more quickly and into our rivers. And we don't have that spring snow melt that's washing off that would feed the rivers throughout the year. So it's washing off the mountains more quickly, and so we're getting the earlier spring peaks and less available in the summertime when we need it to grow food. Of course, the increasing extremes of flooding and drought, and with that the wildfire risk, and changes to extreme heat and cold, longer growing seasons, which I'll return to a little bit later, shorter snow and ice seasons, and so on. So not a great picture hydrologically, and really impacting the availability and the timing of availability of water. I want to focus on a few slides here of some work that I've done with the NASA GRACE Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment mission. This is a paper that came out in 2018. And so what we're looking at is a map of the trends of how the total amount of water availability, all of the snow, surface water, soil, moisture, groundwater together has changed over this time period. And blue colors are gaining water and red colors are losing water. And so there's actual structure to this map. It's really not just a bunch of blobs. I'll try to break it down for you. So we've got these hotspots for places that are really losing water, like the Greenland ice sheet. And, the ice sheets are melting away. The glaciers are melting away. We're starting to see the patterns that we expect to be coming from climate change, these broad patterns of high latitudes getting wetter and low latitudes getting wetter, and in between the mid latitudes getting drier. So there's like this background pattern with these hot spots for too much or too little on top. Here's some of the flooding that's been happening over the lifetime of the GRACE mission, starting to show up in these images, and some of the droughts. And one that really has a lot to do with agriculture is the depletion of the world's major aquifer systems. And so all these spots that you're looking at right now, all of these correspond to the world's major aquifers. Why are they being depleted? Well, mostly because they are providing the water for irrigation for agriculture. As many of you know, 80% of the water that's withdrawn, either from surface water, from rivers or lakes, or from groundwater, is for agriculture, and about half the water that's used for irrigation comes from groundwater. So these are largely unmanaged, or many parts of the world. In some places, we're just getting that management in place. So a very complicated picture. Let's take a look at Canada. So the same map, just zooming in on Canada. So these are the Alaskan glaciers, but also getting into British Columbia. We'll drill down into that a little bit more. So these are now the monthly time series. So before, sort of the colors are the long-term trends over the lifetime of the GRACE mission. These are the monthly data, the monthly ups and downs. So like wet season, dry season, wet season, dry season. You can see the trend there shown in the dashed red line. So here's the Athabasca region. Of course, as we head over towards the ice sheets, things are really melting away. And then across this lower tier of Canada, things are getting a little bit wetter. So around Quebec and Toronto, over near me. So, we've got places that are getting wetter and places that are getting drier. And that's, it's happening all over the world. And it's creating some real problems for accessibility, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. So let's drill down a little bit more into BC. And so I just picked out a few of these boxes here that sort of corresponded with where some of the agricultural activity is. So, things going up here, but then starting to go down. Overall downward trend here. Likewise here, overall downward trend. So now we're getting into that sort of big red spot that was on the map as we head up, on the other map as we head up this way. So, good news, bad news. The good news is we can track some of this stuff, and the bad news is that a lot of the trends are downward. But that doesn't mean we should stick our heads in the sand, and we need to be thinking about how we can arrest some of these downward trends if we can. If they correspond to overuse, or whatever we can do to slow climate change will help out. So the picture, gets a little bit more complicated. These are just the aquifers that I showed you. And, they're in these regions of the world that are getting drier. Okay, so we use groundwater in these areas. We use groundwater for agriculture in these areas. They're getting drier, which is probably due to climate change, which means that their replenishment, recharge into the aquifers is going to be further limited. So, more bad news. In fact, when we look around the world, over half the world's major aquifers, these are the aquifers that are recognized by the United Nations, the 37 major aquifers. And over half of them are being depleted. Those are the ones that are shown in orange and yellow and red. So, outflows greater than inflows. Some of these places is happening quite rapidly. Many of these are unmanaged. So this is the kind of thing we want to try to avoid in Canada. We're actively having these discussions here in Saskatchewan as well. So yeah, just a few papers that I've written. This one actually, so global groundwater crisis and sort of tracking this stuff. And this actually just came out a couple of weeks ago. And these are just some of the time series that correspond to some of those aquifers that I showed in the last map. So lots of downward trajectories. I spent a lot of time in California. I moved up here from California. We can use the GRACE data to track groundwater storage variations. It takes some research, it takes work to extract it from the GRACE signal. I won't get into that today. But this picture emerges. So we're looking at the Central Valley here in California and the groundwater storage changes that we're getting from remote sensing. And so we see this sort of recharge and then a big depletion phase during a drought when the farmers don't have surface water available, so they use more groundwater. Little recharge and then big depletion phase during a drought. This is the farmers switching to groundwater. Same thing here. So we're right, almost up to the present here. That's part of a long-term pattern that's been going on in the Central Valley. This figure goes back to 1962, but really this pattern's been going on since the 30s when irrigation started. The colors in the background here are showing whether climate is very dry, drought, or very wet. The light blue, so dark tan is drought, dark blue, sorry, is wet period, or moderately wet, and light blue, moderately dry. We're looking at cumulative groundwater storage changes throughout this time period. The red are data from the US Geological Survey. The blue are data from the GRACE mission that we tacked onto the end here. Same pattern that I just showed you. Little recovery, big drop, right? Little recovery, big drop. So it's very much like a tennis ball, bouncing down the stairs. And so what's happening here, groundwater is it's a free for all, it's disappearing. And lots of other stuff is happening as well. Like streams are being depleted, water tables are dropping, it's getting more expensive to drill wells. The quality of the groundwater is decreasing. Accessibility is becoming an issue. It costs over $1 million to dig a 2,500 foot well in the middle of the Central Valley, which is the average water table depth. In terms of communicating these issues, this was a simple figure I put together to correspond. I can't remember if it was a paper or something that came out. But this, more than any of the technical stuff that I've ever been asked to talk about, these sorts of images go a long way in communicating the problem to the general public. So this is just showing some outtakes from an animation we made with the GRACE data. And this and I made this without really thinking about it too much, sitting at my kitchen table one day. And the sort of green, yellow, red sort of traffic signal color scheme really resonated. So this thing was all over the place the day after we put it together. Really has had a big impact on the sort of thinking of what was happening in California. So, California is a bit of a success story. And I know you talked about it last week. And so it is a place where scientists and the media and the government and the nonprofits, everyone was on point during these two phases of drought, 2006 to 2010, and especially 2011 to 2014 or 2015. And that is really probably the reason why California was able to pass the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I won't go into the details. You talked about it last week, but it passed, and there was a crisis. There was a motivated government. There was messaging, excellent messaging. The media, the newspapers, and a lot of the scientists in California, a lot of my colleagues and myself were working hard on it. So now we're in Canada. You're in BC. I'm in Saskatchewan, and this is a figure that's showing for remote sensing how food production is increasing in some of these regions around the world, especially this region here where I live. It's already visible by satellite. The darker green means more greening, more productivity. We know that the growing season is going to lengthen as the temperature increases. So there is opportunity to grow more food We talk about doubling food production here in Saskatchewan. And just repeating the slide from before, Canada's water supply is becoming far more variable. So how are we going to do it? There's really challenges. Big challenges ahead. Here in Saskatchewan, we're proposing a $4 billion irrigation expansion without a lot of work that I've seen that really assesses impacts along the Saskatchewan River Basin, along the river to the groundwater and so on. I don't think we're making a lot of progress on some of our groundwater management, and the Grace mission has shown us that pictures that I've shown you. The Grace follow-on mission launched in 2018, same mission, just the first one sort of burned out, batteries died. And so new mission was kicked off in 2018. So Grace showed us all of those images that I showed you. The follow-on is showing us, which started in 2018, that things aren't really changing. These are some groundwater papers that we published in my group, right? So things aren't improving. We published this paper in India in 2009, and here we are today. We published this California paper in 2011, and here we are today. Published this Middle East paper in 2013, right? Things are continuing downward. Colorado River Basin, getting worse than ever when it comes to groundwater. Groundwater is disappearing in Arizona. And those trend maps that I showed you, the aquifer map and the big color blue and red, orange map, they look the same. So the patterns, the depletion is not changing. So the human fingerprint on the freshwater landscape through climate change, ice melting, changing extremes, and water management or lack thereof is a dominant force that's really changing. This is a change map. And with it come real major threats to water security and food security that I think are happening a lot faster than people realize. The implications, there's many, right? Food producing regions, especially those in the mid latitudes and those aquifers that all show up as red spots, red blobs, are in a state of chronic water scarcity. It's not drought, it's just they're trying to do more than they can with limited amount of water, and the water is disappearing. There's the accessibility issues, the haves and have-nots. Do you live over a red spot? Do you live in a blue area? Do you live in a red area? We're not talking politics here. We really need to really assess our water availability in the way that we would have, the way that we do with oil. We don't do that with water because water is undervalued. Groundwater in particular, it's a critical element of provincial, state, national, international water supplies. It does not get into the national discussion. California is a great example of a state that's trying to grow food for a nation, and we eat plenty of California produce. I'm going to go after this. I'm going to go over to Sobeys, and in the produce section, there's a bunch of stuff from California, including lots of berries and lots of produce. Trying to do it just with California's water. These regional problems require sometimes regional transboundary solutions. And as I mentioned before, anything that impacts climate change mitigation policy is also going to benefit water security. I just want to finish up by taking a look at this map and really thinking about, how do we keep British Columbia from going further in the red, right? This is like deficit spending, right? We have this opportunity, especially in some of these blue spots. How do we keep the rest of Canada, the prairies, for example, where we still grow a lot of food, how do we keep it from going in the red at all? And so, we need those policy interventions. We need those financial interventions. We need more than just technology. I think we're sort of past, we can get this message out, but we need to do more to make a difference. I think that's my last slide. So just some other information here, contact information and so on, websites. That's it. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes now to answer questions from the audience. So if you haven't already, please type your question into the Q&A box. And I guess we'll allow a couple minutes to do that. And maybe in the meantime, I'll just ask you a question. So this GRACE data, this remotely sensed data, seems to be really powerful for showing the depletion of aquifers over time. And I'm just curious about how often that data is updated and how kind of not real time, but how much that tells us what's happening now as opposed to what's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. And then the extent to which that would be useful in policy interventions and questions about how do we allocate groundwater.
Yeah, so the data are updated. So we get new data every month. It takes about a month to make a gravity field. But we don't release the data. The new data sets are released probably every 6 months or so because it's a complicated process. And it's a different satellite and it's gravity based. And so there's lots of work that goes on. So we get new data updated every 6 months or so. There are some operational products that actually work in near real time. So like those GRACE data are actually incorporated into the US Drought Monitor in near real time. So it's a little both. It's a challenge with those data to use them. They're very compelling at large scales, right? So you can show ministers and premiers and governors and senators and members of parliament. You can show them regional and national scale pictures and they get it. It's tougher to actually use it in operations. It really has to be integrated with other data sets. And so you really need like a strong research partner to do that.
Great, thank you. So we have a question coming in from Brianna, who says, I'm concerned about how in BC we can further push policy on regional and provincial water agricultural laws. I keep seeing massive winery operations built every year where our province continues to burn forest fires every August. So it seems kind of like a time bomb as a young person wondering if politics and science are kind of talking to each other. And if not, where do you see that progress happening?
So excellent question. And we also see this disconnect between economic growth and actual water availability. See a bunch of stuff happening in the United States with bottled water being mined in drought-stricken regions. I will say that I think Canada's in better shape than the United States in terms of conveying this message and getting it across at a high level. We're having these discussions about a Canada Water Agency. So I think that there is more of an openness in Canada to understanding this message, to listening to this message, and to acting on this message. That said, we need more than policy. So the financial side is also an important side. There's been a lot of work with working with investors, big investors, retirement fund companies that, we do it in climate and now we're moving towards doing it in water. So, we will not invest in your winery unless you follow these, you don't partake in these particular processes.
Great. I don't see any other questions yet, but I'm thinking we might have some trickle in for you as we get through the next presentations. Maybe at the end we can circle back to any other additional questions for Dr. Famiglietti. And thank you very much for your presentation. So I'll now introduce Dr. Oliver Brandis, who is an economist and a lawyer by training. He serves as the co-director of the POLIS project on ecological governance, which is based at the University of Victoria's Center for Global Studies. His work focuses on water sustainability, resource management, public policy development, and legal and institutional reform. So take it away, Dr. Brandis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful chance, a nice chance to connect with Jay and to virtually meet some new people. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, also known as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Washonack communities. And I'm thankful also at the Colquitts Creek. I always like to orient myself by my water body. And I'm gonna pull up my PowerPoint here. And I'm gonna have a very different kind of presentation because mine is gonna be a little bit more focused around the law and institutional regime and how it relates to agriculture in that sense. I'm going to start by giving you a little overview here. And I think the main message I hope you're going to get when we're done is that water sort of connects to the numerous issues of the day. I'm going to be a lot more BC focused because that's the context in our Canadian Constitution where a lot of the water management laws, governance happen. So it'll be very provincially based. And I'm going to connect us, I'll give you that little brief, what I call water issues kind of tour. Jay did a fabulous job of showing us the global picture and the national picture. I'm going to dive a little deeper into the Water Sustainability Act. I know I saw from the audience a number of people are familiar or in government, so they're a little bit aware, but I'm going to give you sort of my take on things. And the very interesting emerging watershed security mandate and how that might influence where we go from here. I like this opening slide, especially when I'm talking to folks who are thinking about agriculture because of that wonderful notion, right? Food grows where water flows, or no water, no food. And it's not just folks like Jay and myself and probably most people on the call, but there's an increasing understanding that water crises are at the top of not just the global risk. And I don't like to think of it as a global issue because it's really a manifestation of a great many local issues that add up to a global issue. And there's many responses, and I just throw one up. It's just been in the headlines recently where we see California water futures begin trading amid fear of scarcity. So that's sort of one of the things that we think about of how do we respond. You know, and putting us in the BC scene, we know our watersheds are under pressure. I think this is well understood. You know the various pieces. I like to throw that piece up to really give us a little drama, right? We see these droughts increasingly common, increasingly intensifying, whole new category, right? The notion of a winter drought was a new concept. And it's interesting because of Jay's comment, and we didn't coordinate at all, but he talked about California a fair bit. And we did a number of projects, as I put in the chat, where I compared some of the laws and some of the responses. And what we're seeing really is a Californication of the West, of BC, really following many of these patterns. And when we did our early work, which was only maybe 5 or 6 years ago, people said we were crazy to be doing the work in that comparative way because California had nothing to do with BC. And yet we're seeing the climate trends and we're seeing some of the legal and institutional responses, not surprisingly, following a bit of pattern. And again, the last of my sort of context setting slides, we really see this notion of provincial water problems, this insecurity, right? This fire, flood, drought, unsafe water, which I like to call the 4 horsemen of the water apocalypse. And what we see is a number of drivers, right? We see it amplified by climate change, but we also see really important contributing factors around poor land use practices. Forestry is most common probably in the headlines, but we see some role for agriculture. And we see this mounting both concern and then the response, this appetite for change, which is really underpinning kind of where we are at. And on the far right there, you can see an example of a report where we looked at these emerging hotspots, that notion of the really regional adding up to both a provincial priority, a national priority, and a global issue, right? So you have these kind of dots showing up everywhere and increasingly more common. So that's the context. I think you all believe that the water situation is changing and the climate's having a big part of that. And so this is a bit about how we as humans or we as societies respond. And this is going to be a brief sort of 101 on the state of BC water law and policy. And I always like to start by saying, well, how do we decide? Who decides? And in Canada, it's complicated because the water is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. And we see at least 4 what I call authority holders or legitimate jurisdictions playing a role. And that's, of course, the federal and the provincial, which are obvious. Increasingly common, especially around source protection or land decision, is local government. And of course, Indigenous governments and Indigenous authority, including Indigenous law, all playing a role. And so the answer to the question of who decides and where are the sort of simple steps is not always obvious. For most water lawyers, this is what the sum total of water law looks like. It's about the minimum amount of water to keep the fish alive, and it's about the drinking water, the stuff that comes out of your tap. And what we're increasingly seeing, and certainly in BC, is we're beginning to understand that it's much more complex, that it's actually housed in a much broader mix of things. And that's when I like to bring in this picture, and I always say, be wary of lawyers bringing pictures of laws, because you can see a very complicated story here. And we're not going to dwell, but we're going to put Water Sustainability Act in the middle as probably one of the most significant pieces. Of course, Indigenous water law as a parallel authority plays an important role. But in the Crown context, the Water Sustainability Act is really critical. And I identify 3 others, so a total of 4 that are really significant. And I noticed in the introductions, a few folks from the Ministry of Agriculture, and we know that under the Environment Management Act, there is a new regulation called the Agriculture Environment Code of Practice, which is like a regulation, and that will have a lot of significant impact on farm activities, more about groundwater and groundwater contamination. But for the purposes of the remainder of today, we're going to chat a bit more about the Water Sustainability Act specifically. And I like to ground us in a little bit of history, because these principles of water law still exist. So we have to understand, where did it come from? So we have an older Water Act that came as of 1909, but was over 100 years old. And its goal was really simple, was to facilitate gold mining and agricultural development. So it was to create certainty on the landscape, on a landscape that had an abundance of water and a relatively small population. It was certainly no environmental law. It was about resource extraction rules. It fundamentally ignored First Nations rights and title, and asserted as a fundamental notion this idea of Crown ownership. But again, I emphasize it was really useful for what its purpose was, which was about creating clear rules and certainty on an well, at the time seemed like a certain landscape, but now we increasingly understand an uncertain landscape. Water and water shifting all the time. And there's a couple of underlying principles that hold out still today. Crown ownership, which is contested. We have this notion of first in time, first in right, which is the first come, first serve system. So the oldest license has the highest priority. And we see this real importance of the economic link. Beneficial use, or a use it or lose it principle, is about whether you're using the water to make money. And of course, as is common in Canada, and in fact, most sort of English Commonwealth systems, is we have a management and enforcement through an administrative action. So it's a reliant on discretionary statutory decision-making, and can often be quite siloed or fragmented, as different ministries think about the problem quite differently. And of course, in a modern world, which is sort of more consistent with this picture, you can see how things are changing. It's much more interconnected. So that gives us the moment where we bring the Water Sustainability Act into focus. And we know that it came in 2016, actually on Leap Day. And it really is framework legislation. And in my view, and from a lawyer's perspective, it is still in its infancy. It's 5 years in, and we only have really a modest amount of the initial wave of regulations completed. And so this idea of an unfinished house is very powerful imagery. We have a whole bunch of really critical pieces that aren't put in place yet, because the regulations will offer the specificity and make it very operational. But fundamentally, it changes a few of the really important contexts. Number one, it takes the old system, which really applied to surface water only, and ignored groundwater, because from a lawyer's mind, they did not see this as an integrated resource. Anybody who works on the landscape, whether they're a farmer, a forester, a municipal planner, you understand that surface water and groundwater are greatly interlinked, but legally they were not. So now we have groundwater captured in the bubble. And we see a few interesting developments, like legal protections for environmental flow needs, better linkages between water and land. This very common understanding that what happens on the land shows up in the water is now getting some attention. So we're seeing the Water Act move to much more of an ecologically grounded system rather than an economically grounded system. And we, of course, see this notion of first in time, first in right, or a property rights system. And we see some ways to get off ramps, some ways to avoid this system, because it can be very problematic because it creates a rigidity. And of course, much more space for partnerships, delegated and spaces for Indigenous water law, which would be a conversation for another day. But to remember that there's an unbelievably fundamental linkage between environmental flows, Indigenous rights and uses, whether we're talking about fishing rights, hunting rights, self-determination, sacred spaces. This is fundamental. And so the Water Act has to reflect that. And so if we take a couple of the key pieces, we have in the Act legal protections for both environmental flows and critical flows, where I differentiate them as saying thriving versus surviving. A critical flow is enough to survive. Environmental flow is what you need to thrive, to exist in an ongoing way. And these are some of the legal touch points, the legal provisions that allow those pieces to happen. And the only one of the sort of new batch that have been used in the 5 years is around these fish population protection orders in the Cook-Sila watershed here near me on Vancouver Island, where in essence, some water users were told they had to change their water use patterns because of the impacts to fish populations. And this is kind of a simple summary to show this is the old management system, really, where we saw human use ever encroaching on the environment, where the environment was sort of secondary. And we see that as human licenses and allocations increase, the impacts to the environment, of course, are significant as the amount for the environment shrinks. And a 21st century approach is increasingly about recognizing we have to find a much better balance. And that's where this act offers us a number of the really critical tools to let us do that. You could have a lengthy session on each of these tools and how they operate and what the purpose is and what the legal implications are. I offer in the chat, and there's a picture of it, one of the reports where we kind of canvass all of these. I'm going to dive a little deeper on two of them that I think will be of the most interest to the agricultural community, or those thinking about agriculture in particular. I'm going to start by saying, listen, there's a number of planning tools and there's a whole spectrum. And to help us visualize, I try and simplify it from simple as a spork all the way to the really complicated Swiss Army knife with every possible tool. And the tools in the Act are similar in that sense. Water objectives are fairly straightforward, and we understand how they could be used, all the way to a water sustainability plan, which is sort of a tool that could be used for a whole bunch of different purposes. And with that idea in mind, we talk about one particular tool being this water objective, where we see the ability to link land and water decision-making, where things like temperature or certain considerations like nitrate levels or riparian protection areas or water quality with certain indicators might create some ecosystem-based parameters. And that then, in turn, land and resource use decision makers will have to consider these. And if they fail to, in essence, those decisions, as I mentioned previously, in a statutory decision-making framework, those decisions then can be challenged under administrative law. It allows for a much more integrated approach, land and water, and it can be done on a variety of scales, landscape or site level. And that's going to be very significant to any operation on the landscape. Of course, you're going to ask me, well, show me how this has worked. And I'll say, well, I can tell you theoretically how it could work, because we don't have any examples yet. Because in British Columbia, under the Water Sustainability Act, Section 43 hasn't been used yet. And that to me speaks to one of the problems or one of the concerns we're going to have, which is the relatively slow rollout of the operationalization of what is a potentially useful piece of legislation. The second tool I want to talk just a little bit more about are water sustainability plans. And they're unbelievably powerful. They're the Cadillac or the luxury model of tools, because basically they're the most versatile and can address a whole host of problems. It can change water entitlements, including clawing back existing uses, of which there are very few ways to do that in law under the Act. You can only do it over time with every 40 years review time, or through water sustainability plans, or your failure to use the water resource properly, failing the beneficial use test. And then there's a number of key pieces that I highlight here. I won't go through it all, but I'm going to emphasize that there's a linkage between land and water. There is a really critical space to create responsive drought plans that are much more localized. They're going to be more specific. They're going to be more phased. They're going to potentially embed innovation. An example we have thought of is around local drought fund that may pay users to reduce water during those critical times, which in BC certainly is that sort of July to September window, where you see often a second watering of hay, often the oldest license, maybe not a high economic value, but that would get priority over, say, wineries or municipal uses. And so are there mechanisms that can correct that? I'm going to end with saying there is a big leap here still, because we have a real operational challenge as we take some of the very good legal tools and have to put them into place. And before we kind of get into the broader discussion, I'm going to just mention a few things that we need to think about next. And this is about the watershed security mandate that we see in this government and we're seeing emerging globally as a priority. One of the commitments is around this idea of a watershed security fund. It's building on what is an existing Healthy Watersheds initiative. And one of the programs of this 27 million in the COVID economic recovery relates to supporting farms and farm organizations in helping adapt to some of these changes, to doing better at farm practices to reduce nitrates that may impact groundwater, for example, or to increase better irrigation innovations to improve water use on site. There's a whole host, but this is just one simple example. And of course, I'd like to emphasize that we know no matter what, there's going to be a number of drivers of change. Here's the big list, right? UNDRIP is going to be a driver, the declining natural capital and rural economic instability, cumulative effects and community conflicts, this changing complexity as climate and hydrology are constantly in flux, and of course the economic recovery. That will necessitate much more of a watershed approach, which bringing us back to the opening points, the Water Sustainability Act allows the legal tools to be deployed in a much more effective way, but ultimately it's going to be part of a much larger change around governance, which is really sitting at the front of who decides, how do we make those plans, and how do we make those rules enforceable. So I see that I'm about 17 minutes, which is about 2 minutes over what I said I would do this in, but I've hopefully given you a few tasters for our discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Oliver. We have quite a few questions here. And I think maybe we'll start with a couple questions that I think are relevant to both of our presenters, so you both might want to comment a little bit. We have a question around BC started regulating groundwater in 2016 with the Water Sustainability Act. So do you think that this will have a beneficial effect on groundwater resources or not? And there's a comment around that it's very difficult to make allocation decisions with little information about the available groundwater resources. Will we stop issuing new licenses when we exceed a carrying capacity? Who will make that call? And so maybe we'll start with you, Oliver, and then see if.
So to answer, I think both those questions can absolutely be stated as a strong yes. Groundwater regulations will change groundwater use. And it means that the whole host of tools I talked about could now be used for groundwater, meaning before it only related to surface water. So planning, you could cut off, you could have a critical flow during a shortage and you would cut off users. In essence, groundwater users join the system. And so they would be subject to any of these sustainability kind of tools, which means reducing water use. So that's definitely net positive. The other part though, of course, without the science, it becomes very hard to allocate. We have kind of three things happening simultaneously. We have to bring the old users, historical users who were not regulated into the system, and they may already be in over-allocated situations, and that makes things very hard from a legal perspective, and I can go down that road. You have to do this transition period, which is what we're happening, and it's been very slow. There's an estimate about 20,000 licenses that need to be issued. Only about 5,000 folks have applied to get those licenses. So we're looking at about a quarter. So when we hit this magic date of 2022, we're gonna have a whole lot of maybe 15,000 people in non-compliance. And that's gonna be a problem. So that's a legal institutional problem. So what are the incentives to get those people transitioning in? And then the third aspect is the future. So yes, future licenses will absolutely have more conditions, more criteria. And in fact, in some regions, like the Coxsara, like the Okanagan, you may see no future licenses because there is simply not enough water available. And so that has real implications. And that's really why I talk about the Californication of British Columbia, because we're going to go from an abundant system where we had a licensing where basically you signed up, you got it, to a system where there's limits. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to share and what are the mechanisms by which we're going to share during those really key pinch points. I could go deeper if you want, but I maybe want some more questions.
So okay, I just want to add on to that. The availability part is critical. And so this is something that we just don't do well around the world. So, you know, there's basically like three things we need to know. We need to know with respect to groundwater, how much we have. In most places we don't know. And the have part also means sort of like what is accessible, what's the quality of it. You know, sometimes people will say, well, there's tons of groundwater, but after you get past a certain depth, you might as well be using seawater. So what's how much, you know, what does that freshwater lens look like? How much do we really need to use to do the things that we want to do? And how are those things changing over time, right? With population growth, with climate change, you know, it's basically looking at the gap between the supply and the demand. But on the groundwater side, it's trickier than you might think. People don't want to share data. I don't know what the regulations are, Oliver, on you know, on monitoring and reporting. So
no, that's a great point, because that's one of those unfinished rooms in my house, right? They have good provisions in the act, but the regulations aren't in place. So some examples, like in the Northeast around oil and gas, are doing a decent job of reporting, but in the Southern, we're not. And we're basing our decisions not on actual use, but on allocated use, which may not be a realistic amount. So there's a lot of learning here that needs to happen, that's for sure.
Great, thank you. And Oliver, we have a comment here that came through the chat actually, but just a quick question on how the WSA interacts with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in BC.
Yeah, that's a complex question. So it's very important to understand that UNDRIP is international law that has been in essence adopted into Canada through BC's DRIPA, Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And that has a lot to do with how Crown will relate to Indigenous people, Indigenous government, Indigenous law. That's that early busy picture I showed you where Indigenous law is separate from Crown. And from the water, one of the main commitments is that all future laws and regulations will be written in alignment with these principles, the most important of which is around self-determination and free, prior, informed consent. The Water Sustainability Act was not written with that in mind because DRIPA didn't exist yet. There are lots of provisions in the Act, however, that will allow for a dual authority situation, like the water sustainability plans, like certain kinds of delegated decision-making where we can see co-governance being manifested. That is what I would call a work in progress. So the Water Sustainability Act does not yet manifest. And the biggest failure the Water Sustainability Act has is this assertion of Crown ownership. Indigenous people, by and large, do not agree that the Crown owns the water resource. They will suggest that they are indeed the first users. I would largely agree. And so we have to reconcile that part of it. So that's one of the pieces of the Water Sustainability Act that probably needs a heavy duty update. But there's a longer conversation. Not surprising, we've done a little bit of work on that. So if you go to our website, you can see we've done some work around how that might look in the water context.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we have a few more questions here. And one of them is, so last week we learned about, I believe they call it SIGMA, the legislation in California. And what we learned was they told different areas in California to basically organize themselves into groundwater management authorities to come up with sustainability plans for groundwater to meet these objectives that they had outlined. And if they failed to do so, then the state would come in and impose a plan. And so the comment from John Janman at UBCO, we seem to be the opposite. The water use plan requires a whole bunch of things to be put in place if the local areas are going to have something acceptable to the province. For the provisions of the WSA. So what are your thoughts on that, Oliver, in terms of this sort of top-down versus bottom-up organizing ourselves?
Yeah, so I think, so I know John well, and there's an interesting tension. So indeed, California has much more of an intention to create a decentralized model with the, in essence, state being the backstop when they fail. They're much closer to the tipping crisis point, the cliff. They're about to fall off the cliff. Arguably, in some areas, they already have. BC, which I wouldn't agree with, chose not to do that. They're using the tools which are very similar, like the water sustainability plan is very similar to that same organizing principle, but these are only triggered under what I would call unique circumstances. So it's designed in BC to be the exception, not the norm. And so there's a bunch of baseline pieces like bringing the groundwater allocation system into place, like making sure environmental flows are considered in all decisions. These are apply everywhere. And then regional pockets, when they approach crisis, can trigger one of these plans. California said, well, we basically have a crisis everywhere, so we're gonna start on these plans everywhere all at once. BC somewhat naively is probably anticipating that this can happen over the next decade or two, which we've seen in the last 5 years, the accelerating problem. So it's very unlikely if we're gonna address it, we're gonna need like 10 of these water sustainability plans all in the next 2 or 3 years. Very hard to do.
Okay, great. And we have kind of a related question that got a vote by someone, so I'll ask this one is, how well is that California model working to either of your knowledge in reality? Is it effective?
So let me jump in. So, I actually used to be on the state water board. So had a lot of input into the formation of this, and I left before things really got going. My impression is that there's a lot of uncertainty. So the structure was 2 years to form these groundwater sustainability agencies. It was roughly 2015 to 2017. They ended up with about 200. 5 years to write the sustainability plans. And so that would be like 2022. So they're coming up on that. That itself posed major challenges. What data, these small groundwater districts, what data are they going to use? Should they all be using the same data? Do they have money to hire consultants? The governance of the actual agencies, how do they do it? Is it by acreage? Are they voted in? Are they appointed? So, I think that from my impression, I think the jury's out. Then it's 20 years after the plan is approved, 20 years to come into sustainability. How do you do these measurements? Right? There's a lot of wiggle room. I didn't go through the different points of sigma, but, not unreasonable subsidence, and don't seriously degrade the groundwater quality. Don't deplete the streams too much. There's a lot of flexibility. That's why it passed, because of that flexibility. That's how it got through. But the other thing is 2042 is pretty far away, and from our satellite data, I showed you, here's when we wrote the paper, here's today, and that's still a downward trajectory. So I don't know, Oliver, what do you think?
Well, I think you hit a key point. We know that society, unfortunately, doesn't change based on what our scientists tell us. And that's one of the defects also of the way the Canadian legal system, the evidence part of it plays a secondary role. And so I would agree. I mean, we've done some comparative work. California is much more at a crisis stage, yet they seem to be taking a go slow approach, which seems remarkable.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But to be fair, BC has got an even slower approach. So, I would like to see many of the provisions. I think the provisions that California put in probably could have worked for BC, because that timeline, maybe we have enough room to maneuver. I think California needs to be going at about twice the pace. And given that we have, in essence, failure to launch in BC, we need to really pick up the pace. And so I would say that there are some really good provisions. Again, there's a very different underlying legal system, and we can't forget that. California has a public trust doctrine, and water rights are much more akin to property rights. In Canada, we do not have property rights. We're explicitly not about property rights, and the state intervention, the government's intervention in this is much more legally appropriate. Now, lots of ranchers and farmers will say, no, it's my water. Well, legally it's not. And so there's lots more room for creative innovation here. And I would argue we're not that close to the edge yet, that we can still have those 2 or 3 years to do the planning processes and put some of the pieces in place. I know many of the speakers here are UBC, are from the Okanagan, and there's some good examples of governance innovation there in the form of some local bodies, the Okanagan Watershed Board, that can help concentrate the issues on the right scale at least, which a lot of places in Canada that misses.
Great, great insight. So we got a question here that's got a couple of votes. And I think it's directed towards Oliver. How do you see the future of agriculture then, if water has already been allocated and there is a real possibility that no further licenses will be issued in some areas? How will the agriculture sector deal with that reality? And I might add and sort of call back to something that Jay, you brought up, in that demand for food production is also increasing at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox. As the temperature gets warmer, the growing season gets longer, and these regions that are very ripe for growing have ever less water. And so once upon a time, the defining feature was how much land did you have for agriculture? Well, in short order, it's going to be how much water do you have for agriculture? And so then we have to make really tough social decisions, social choices about what our priority is. Economics, so this is my economist brain coming out, says in some regions in the world, as food prices change and certain low value, high water crops just become less desirable. So you replace that. That has implications, of course, but you will see, I think, crop substitution. You'll see innovation on the technology end. You'll see things like wastewater, which has that name waste, implying it's bad. Well, that's really changed. In southern US states, wastewater is a coveted resource used for all kinds of economic gains. So yeah, there's a reckoning. There's going to be some agricultural changes, and in some regions we simply won't have the same never-ending growth in agriculture. That's the bottom line. I guess that's a bit of that.
So I really want to follow up on that. And so I look at more of like the end member scenario, which is, I look at these aquifers where the water's disappearing. And so the southern part of the Central Valley, the southern part of the Ogallala or the High Plains Aquifer. And so if they run out of water, I think the societal decision is, do you move water because the food system, right, is optimized around some of these locations. So like, are you going to move water there because the food system is optimized, or are you going to move the agriculture to where the water is, or, something in between? So, that's out there. And, all the things that you said, Oliver, are true, right? We could be looking more, and that's what we have to do in the short term, right? The more efficiencies, the thinking about the crop choices. But, if people want to go full throttle, Southern Ogallala is talking about, 2 or 3 decades, no more groundwater. What happens then, right? It's some of it's just accounting.
Yeah, and I think, again, from my perspective, it's very important to recognize that water is one of many things. So there's a huge ecological implication. So the mass movement of water has huge implications. And if we thought about water only for agriculture, I think a lot of those things hold. But in Canada, the sort of reduction of interbasin transfers is very contentious politically and has huge ecological implications. Of course. So you're going to see us, agriculture included, amongst everything in society, will have to adapt. And so on the flip side, I think, and Jay, you might know this better, I know that some of the early climate adaptation scenarios showed regions that were historically not good growing areas suddenly showing up. So parts of northern BC suddenly, like I know in my area, I can grow an avocado, which I couldn't do that 15 years ago. Well, now I can. And so other regions, in the interior, in the north, these are suddenly going to be very important, very rich agriculture areas. So there will be adaptation. I think that's inevitable.
Jay and Oliver, are you willing or able to answer a couple more questions? I know we're right at 2 here, so if you have somewhere else you have to be, I don't want to keep up too much of your time, but if you are willing to answer a couple more questions, we've got a few more sitting in the, yeah.
I'm happy to stay. Of course, anybody who has these questions, I love hearing Jay's perspective on things too, so. Okay,
excellent. So a question from John Wagner. Could you speak to two issues concerning WSPs? First, have any been implemented yet, or are any in an advanced stage of planning? And how difficult is it for those to be created as bottom-up processes?
So it's a great question. It's dear to my heart. Again, we did that one publication, and I'm sure that we can distribute them. We look at them in detail from a legal perspective. So there are none yet. There are two that are extremely close. One is in Langley, which is under the old act, there was a planning provision that was largely done, never signed off by the minister at the time, 2009, 2010. And so it sat, and it still sits. And in essence, are they going to take the old, what was called a water management plan, and just kind of hocus pocus and turn it into a water sustainability plan? That's an example of an easy. You can just do that because the work, the community engagement, all that stuff has been done. And that is largely driven by groundwater and urban issues. So it's everything Jay just talked about is literally living right there. And then the Coxsila is the other one that the previous minister, Doug Donaldson, wrote in, basically set up a scoping process that is now being considered. And it is a good example. It's a microcosm of BC. You have a very valuable river. Cowichan tribes have extreme interest, very important fish with not conflicting, but at the same time, significant agricultural activities and a lot of groundwater drawdown that's basically depleting. The surface water licenses have been closed on that system for the better part of 20 years, but because groundwater wasn't regulated, groundwater increased. And so now they have to basically figure out what you're going to do with an over-allocated system, including poor land use in the form of bad forestry practices on private forestry lands. So you see this interconnection of overuse of water, bad land use practice, and then you amplify it with climate change, which basically jeopardizes the local economy, reconciliation, and the fishery. And so that is kind of ground zero, I would argue. And in the next 2 years, you'd see, well, you already see it behind the scenes, but it'll become more obvious. And that, to me, will be a model for the rest of the province.
So sort of a follow-up to an answer you gave earlier, we have a question around, so we've got water for food production, we have water for fish and fish habitat, we've got development uses of water. So how do we prioritize all of these different water uses, and who makes that call?
So I think that's an excellent question. And first of all, you have to have a region understand all those competing uses and embrace them, right? And so, I mean, excellent questions. Who makes the call? Who decides on the governance? What does the governance look like? Are they going to think about all those competing uses? And then even if they are, how do you do the allocation? From my perspective, there's a lot of work to be done on the sort of modeling side, the information side. What are the, so I always like to model the heck out of stuff. And so, can you build a model that has all the right components in it so that you can turn the knobs, right? To say like, okay, what about if we do like 20% for this and 37% for this and, whatever. I don't want to add up to 100 on the fly because I'll mess it up. But that to me is a challenge that is that's a real challenge. So I don't know, Oliver, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. I think that is really important, and that's about social, right? This is governance. This is about society. It's how we get along. And so, in an increasingly fractured world, that gets harder. But I guess our work sort of shows when you do get down to the community level, there are still mechanisms by which we can talk to our neighbor and we can understand, right? And I think that idea of the modeling and the evidence-based system coming together as a community or as a watershed region begins to make these decisions are really important. And there's, some pioneering work that's happened in BC with BC Hydro. Now, it's not related to what we're talking about today, but they did some really interesting analysis where they showed exactly what Jay's talking about. What if we increase hydro flows by 10% or 3%, what does that mean for fish and downstream recreation and, access to water for the community? And so they literally could model it and basically created these trade-off scenarios so that the various stakeholders and rights holders could sit down and actually have a somewhat intelligent conversation about that. Now that's 25 years old, that work, but it shows that it can be done, and it was a model in water planning of its era. We now need to hit the next stage, right? You basically have to do what Jay was talking about, but you have to do it while riding a bike, blindfolded, and shooting at a target that you don't see yet, because we're dealing with climate change and you're dealing with shifting social values, with one resource, groundwater, being a grand mystery to even some of our very best scientists. So I wish them good luck. But I do think we as a society can do it as long as we don't lock ourselves in. Don't create a water act that creates rights in perpetuity. Create systems where we have to constantly revisit, create systems where you have redundancies and riparian protections, so that when we're wrong, and we're always wrong, we're able to make some corrections 3 years, 5 years down the road.
Okay, great. So maybe we'll just ask a couple more here. This one has quite a few thumbs up. So do either of you see any risk of privatization of water in Canada in the future, since it has been mentioned in this conversation that the economics of water usage is playing a major part in decision making?
This is a complicated question, because you can use price signals, and we have our friend John Jamat, who's done a ton of work on our conversation today. Price signals don't necessarily equal privatization. And so we're talking about very common in many parts of the US, and to some, not really in Canada, but certainly internationally, where private corporate entities own the distribution system or the water plant, and therefore can charge certain profits based on that ability. And there's very famous work out of Colombia and Bolivia and other places where that's happened. I don't believe that kind of threat is imminent in Canada, although I would say let's always be vigilant, because it's easy to forget how water is so interconnected to all the issues of the day. And so it really requires us to have this ongoing, I guess, conversation, this kind of localized planning, coupled with a clear understanding that water is a trust that we hold for future generations. It is not something that should be owned outright, and it's in fact very problematic. And so water markets that are very regional and are limited and are bound within an ecological limit may have some value. Water markets as a traded commodity like a stock is probably very problematic, and certainly experiences around the world have suggested that it doesn't lead to very positive community or ecological outcomes.
So, I agree with all that, especially on, like, I don't really, so I haven't been in Canada that long. So, moved here in 2018. The trends that I see, especially with the Canada Water Agency, they're not in that direction. I did want to add, though, sometimes when people talk about privatization, they think about smaller scale things like bottled water. And that's not really, I think of privatization exactly the way that Oliver said. Some private sector entity is taking over the distribution. That's how I think of it. And it happens all over the world. So just wanted to make clear on the bottled water stuff, that's not really privatization. Most of the time it's fully legal. I always see the bottled water question as sort of coming down to consumer demand. If the demand isn't there, then people won't. If people don't want it, then that sector will eventually decrease quite a bit.
And water bottle is an interesting one in BC, because due to the lack of groundwater regulation, there were a number of hotspot water bottlers, and rightly so. They're going to set up shop. They pay nothing in essence for the water except for the cost of pumping it, and they sell it at a huge premium, right? More than gas in some places. And so you need to regulate groundwater for just that reason, so that we make a decision what uses make sense in this aquifer. Is, in a dry, in a desert-like atmosphere, that's not where you want water bottlers. And then you have to charge an appropriate premium so that you're managing the resource properly. And then if there is a market for it, and I personally am not supportive of it, I think it's silly, but you could make an argument about many beverages not making much sense. So I don't like water bottlers taking advantage of what I call the legal loophole, but I think there's a larger society conversation about what water bottles should or shouldn't be used in our society.
Great. So we'll end with one final question. And I see that we do have a few other questions here. And so we'll make sure we save that and save the chat, and we can follow up with our presenters on those last few things. But our last question here is, have other jurisdictions, to your knowledge, outside of BC successfully established agricultural water reserves? And can agricultural water reserves be established outside of a water sustainability plan under the Water Sustainability Act?
So it's a great question. I'm gonna just answer the technical legal part first, because Jay may have more insights. There's a provision in the act that allows for this term, an agricultural water reserve, and it basically is part of a water sustainability plan. This is a legal provision within that structure. There are other ways that a government could reserve some amount of water for agriculture. It has not historically been done in BC because we haven't had the scarcity or crisis that we currently have. So this is the legal provision. It has not yet been used. So basically, you can imagine if there were 5 water sustainability plans in the next 5 years, that's optimistic. Only a handful of them are in these probably very tight agricultural regions. So you would expect some of them to then have an agricultural water reserve, basically allocating a portion so that the agricultural sector could continue to grow, even though we're going to put some restraints on other water uses. But at this point, again, it's lawyers like me who speculate, because the government hasn't laid out its position yet, frankly, because water hasn't been a high enough priority yet.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to you both for your presentations and for sticking around to answer all of our questions. And thank you to the audience for being so engaged and asking such great questions. This has been excellent. We hope that some of you who are still here can join us again next week for our last session in the webinar. We're looking forward to that. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Jay. I've really appreciated it. I've learned lots.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, everybody. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.